Back in 2018, PBS held an event called the Great American Read. The idea was to have people vote on what was collectively considered the best literature from throughout space and time. It ended up being a fairly diverse list, ranging from Don Quixote and Pilgrim's Progress to more contemporary favorites like Oscar Wilde and 50 Shades of Grey. To say the least, PBS did their homework on covering most of the bases, and it led to one of my favorite moments in public broadcasting history. Like, they went all out with this one, I'm telling you. Not only could you vote on the list, but they had a mini-series dedicated to random celebrities popping up to defend everything from literary giants to pulpy action novels. Shaq is on there somewhere defending the Alex Cross series. Like, it's so enjoyable to see what everybody was into. At the end of the day, I wouldn't consider one list to be de facto canon. To me, it was more a game of trying to get your guys to get as high as possible. It was also a chance to talk amongst my family about literature, and hey, who can say no to that? I am an English major after all. If I have any quibbles, it's that To Kill a Mockingbird one. Listen, I'm not here to attack a classic. In fact, I have no trouble believing that some librarians formed a coalition to get it on the top. However, I found the presentation to be a bit dubious. The final countdown featured a Q&A with Aaron Sorkin, who may seem random until you realize this is around when he premiered his stage adaptation. It's good, by the way. I saw it and really liked it. However, timing a list of arbitrary voting and having it line up so perfectly is real tinfoil hat talk right here. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting a bit off track here. Along with my personal voting, I took the opportunity to talk about books I thought should have made the list. Even in its thoroughness, it missed some major hitters on there. However, there was one book in particular that became my main focus. If I had to make the argument for only one, I was going to put forward this one as an unsung classic of 20th century American literature. To some extent, it's because not enough people talk about it anymore. However, it's just because I believe in it that much. If I made a personal top 10, it would be on there. So, what would I nominate, you ask? Drum roll, please. I'll give you a hint. The novel was released in 1944 and was considered revolutionary for its depiction of alcoholism. Its title refers to the phenomena of blacking out during a long bender. While the author would fail to recapture his success on future works, this particular title would become so beloved by Hollywood types that it became an Oscar-winning film by the following year. Figured it out yet? It's The Lost Weekend.
Strange days are here again, and it's getting weirder. Listen to all my problems. I just wanna take the course.
When discussing The Lost Weekend, I think most will fall into one of two camps. You're either someone who has no idea what I'm talking about, or have one specific connection to it. If you're like me, your introduction came in the form of the Billy Wilder film. I personally watched it when I saw all of the Best Picture winners many years back. Don't get me wrong, I love The Lost Weekend. For a film quickly approaching 80 years old, there's a resonance that transcends some dated film techniques. Wilder is a master craftsman, and while I wouldn't rank it as highly as The Apartment or Sunset Boulevard, I think it speaks to his willingness to make dark character studies that challenge societal norms. I don't know that he's made one that feels as uncompromising as this. He's explored some ugliness in a lot of Dark Souls, but let's just say I was so intrigued by what he was doing that I eventually decided, you know what, I'm going to give it a shot. Sorry for the poor choice of words there. My bad.
My name is Charles Jackson, and I'm an alcoholic. My story isn't much different from other people's. It's the story of a man who is made a fool of by alcohol over and over and over, year after year after year, until finally the day came when I learned that I could not handle this alone. I always hope when I speak that I'm speaking to newcomers, but I think equally I wish to reach members of AA who had so much trouble in AA as I did during the first years. And it's these people who are falling in and out of it, as I did for quite a while, that I hope to reach.
As I've said before, I think the book is phenomenal. Author Charles Jackson was said to have written it from a very personal standpoint. He often claimed that everything that happened in the book happened to him in real life, which is bleak, but speaks to his willingness to be open and honest. Vanity Fair claimed that when the book was published, many noteworthy filmmakers approached him because they found it very relatable. In the same article, there's a claim that it led to Herman Mankiewicz attempting to end his life. To be fair, I think my opinions of the novel are clouded by Wilder's goals with making the film. Prior to 1945, American cinema treated alcoholism as a joke. Think W.C. Fields with those gin blossoms. It could just be the time in World War II ending and America coming to terms with a lot of heavy emotions. But The Lost Weekend spoke to some darker truths. Many watching the film have been exposed to war and its many casualties, so the jaded nature of dealing with your problems in a comical fashion probably wasn't as fun as it used to be. I should say that I don't think Charles Jackson wrote The Lost Weekend to capitalize on the moment. If anything, I think his greatest gift and curse was just that he knew how to write about himself, and only himself. He threw so much into those pages that some could ask the question of where he'd go from there. Had he more personal insight, he might have even been able to write his own version of The Last Tycoon. Instead, he struggled to capture the spark again. It's true he wrote many novels since The Lost Weekend, but I doubt any of you can name them without a quick Google search. To add one last insult to injury, The Lost Weekend is the only work he wrote completely sober. With that said, there is one silver lining. He was a major advocate for Alcoholics Anonymous, where he spoke regularly. Which isn't to say that this is the worst way to go. I'd love to be remembered for a single great contribution to society. In my opinion, the greater tragedy around The Lost Weekend is that the film outshines its public awareness. Don't get me wrong, it's a good movie and all. I just think you're doing yourself a disservice if you stop there. The most brilliant part of The Lost Weekend is that it's a reverse noir, but I'll get to that in a minute.
About 1942, I thought this was a hell of a thing to have gone through. Nobody understood what the alcoholic was like. They think he's a deliberate troublemaker, that he's having a good time, that he's doing this on purpose. I knew otherwise. I knew that he was sick, that he was helpless, that there was no answer for him in himself. And I decided to try to write a novel about this from the inside, from my own experience and thinking and observations, describing as well as honestly as I was able, the psychology of the alcoholic. And I wanted to write it in such a way that every reader would know what was the matter with the hero, although he himself never did, which is really what we are like as alcoholics. We are almost always the last one to know it.
I want to provide some context regarding Jackson. He was a lifelong addict who struggled to control his alcoholism. It would eventually lead to his demise, making the ending of his novel especially a little more tragic. Throughout his life, he often struggled with repressing homosexual thoughts. While he was married with wife and kids, there would be signs present of this struggle throughout his work, including rather overtly in The Lost Weekend. Prior to the 1970s, homosexuality in America was considered a mental illness, which meant that he had experienced being put into asylums in order to cure him. As one can guess by modern standards, people cannot simply be cured of being gay through conversion. Still, I can imagine the stigma and isolation that can inspire him to drink. Thankfully, he also had a gift for writing, which led to many short stories and the 1944 novel in question. At its core, The Lost Weekend focuses on 5 days in the life of Don Burnham. He is a writer who hides liquor around his home and is given a chance to be alone to work. While any author will use the excuse that looking out a window for 3 hours is still work, having your impulses close at hand only makes matters worse. You become consumed by your addictions. When you run out, you crave more. Your mind is no longer free of this personal drive until suddenly you're 5 days into a bender that ends with a horrifying bleakness. The only optimism is the metatextual element that maybe, just maybe, the protagonist is really Jackson and writing The Lost Weekend will save him from his demons. Well, yes and no. As I've discussed, everything does catch up with him eventually. There's also evidence that a lot of people relate to his drunken stumbling around the city, losing his sense of self as he becomes consumed with a perverse goal. The fact that Jackson wrote this with such clarity is the real triumph unto itself. The fact that he did it in a manner that is accessible but also creatively exciting only helps my defense. I should say that I don't intend to break down the plot beat by beat. Instead, I want to focus on this now from a style standpoint. On the surface, The Lost Weekend could be considered pseudo-autobiographical. It's written with a sense of realism that provides merit to everything that happens. As the bender continues, the reader believes every bit of motivation that Don has. There's also evidence in the way that he describes movements and thought processes. Everything contributes to the psychological evaluation of an addict that is fairly nuanced. The fact that Jackson is in the denying state and confronts what most would evade allows for a study that is rare in fiction. Jackson as an author is clearly using the text as much as a call for help for Don as he is for himself. Largely, I think this approach is far ahead of its time. Nowadays, I think that confessional approaches to literature provide their own catharsis for certain types of readers. The efforts to connect with like-minded individuals over certain types of struggles has in a lot of ways bettered the world. While it would seem confusing to initially write about your lowest moments of life, I think there is something to doing it honestly and creatively that endears writers like Jackson. It helps to break down taboos and make those struggling feel less alone. I should say that, in spite of this, The Lost Weekend is at best non-fiction only in theory. Much like Sylvia Plath and The Bell Jar, it's a stylized version of truth likely done to better enhance an understanding of the emotional complexities. Had Jackson written something closer to a textbook, there's a good chance that people wouldn't be as interested. There needs to be a personality, and I promise you that Jackson has plenty of it. To get more into subgenres that I think fit the text, I think it's best to start at reverse noir. For context, I am referencing a style of film that was popular in the 1940s. These stories, often focused around corruption and crime with very dark overtones in the femme fatale, is a bleak view that required a detective to solve the crime in order to make any sense of this sick, sad world. There are many classics in the subgenre. For example, from Billy Wilder, there's Double Indemnity. But basically the idea was that the audience would come to be aware of reality as the plot develops. As one can guess, for a story about alcoholism, it's quite the opposite. In some surreal way, the reader starts off knowing less than Don and ends up knowing more. This is done through the subtle slip-ups that come with a fading memory. For example, Don will forget visiting someplace a few dozen pages later. He will instill enough doubt in the reader that his trustworthiness begins to fade. Only we know why he's become so unreliable. He was once a real Boy Scout, now he's nothing. It becomes horrifying when pairing it with the disorienting sense of him wandering through the city. Where Jackson began with the vividness that made it come alive, it ends as this unknown hellscape where everything instills paranoia in Don. Suddenly, he is no longer an independent character. This codependence makes it difficult to trust anyone for fear that they will sabotage his search for mental stability. As a reader, it becomes difficult to read on, knowing that all we can do is watch without having any answer for how to save him. The ending has some arguable relief, but not without the overwhelming sense of what was lost. Very few noirs end happily, and yet the detective always seems to be the same low-level depressive type of functioning citizen as Don is at the beginning. I also see parts of this as being more directly horror. Along with some hallucinatory images, The Lost Weekend can't help but disturb rational minds, because it poses a lot of questions about addiction. Some of them have attainable answers, while others are way too vague. Nobody can understand another person's mind, and yet Jackson manages to convey enough in a way that makes you visualize the metaphorical demons along with the body horror on display. Then again, losing your identity wholesale like this is arguably among the worst things that can happen to someone. As I've mentioned before, Jackson did struggle with homosexual thoughts throughout his life, so that can only add to the burdens that he feels less human, and is more like Frankenstein's monster, simply looking for a place to rest his head. From there, I think the text is pretty straightforward as a read. Even if the outcome is largely predictable given its subject matter, I don't wish to get into spoilers here. What I want to say is that I find the book to be quintessential not only for how it depicts alcoholism in a realistic and honest way, but also because I think Jackson is blending literary styles that may be subtle, but enhances a familiar experience to many, while connecting to someone who may be lucky to not have suffered those demons.
I remember all day long, day after day after day, looking forward to night, to being alone in my room, where I didn't have to see anybody. And then at night, I remember lying awake in my bed and thinking of my New Hampshire neighbors in their little frame houses down in the street, and being keenly aware of how they envied me, because I used to hear this a good deal. But I knew how much I envied them. And I envied them because they had love in their lives. And I didn't. And I didn't seem to be able to have it. It is true that I was living in the midst of my family who loved me. My wife did. My children did. But at the same time, I had no love because I couldn't love anybody. I couldn't get outside of myself. And I think this is the thing that plagues the alcoholic so much.
I will conclude by saying that I am not by any means an expert on addiction nor its use in media. On the one hand, I recognize when it's done poorly, but I also recognize that talking about difficult experience in artistic manners allows for some therapeutic healing and connection with an audience. I think that The Lost Weekend is very much a text that still holds this greater weight a near century later. Some behaviors may seem dated, but Jackson's decision to be self-referential allows it to avoid feeling archaic. Instead, it delves into something so personal that it can't help but be universal. To be honest, there are many other texts that I think mix alcoholism with artistic license that provoke similar emotions. I'm thinking of stuff like John Cheever's The Swimmer or Stephen King's The Shining. I am also a fan of Jonathan Ames' The Alcoholic, which is lesser known, but ties a journey to recovery with a similar level of raw honesty, albeit with a currently more optimistic outcome. I'm sure there's many others, but again, I'm only talking about texts that mean something to me personally. Oh, I also like the movie Smash with Mary Elizabeth Winstead. It's more of a conventional drama, but I consider it to be one of her best roles to date. I can't say the same for Burt Lancaster's version of The Swimmer. I get people like it, but so far a cry from the momentous mindbender that is Cheever's original short story. And with that, I conclude this essay. I would hope that I have inspired you to pick up The Lost Weekend and, at very least, put it on your shelf. I know that we are all busy people and maybe won't get around to it for another few years. However, I think it's one of the texts that challenges the medium and gives us something unique and fulfilling within the literary world. I know that probably wouldn't have made the cut on the Great American Read, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be considered. Part of me is sad that the novel has largely been forgotten. Even if the film deserves attention, I assure you that Jackson's take is even more rewarding of an experience. I should also say use your discretion. If difficult subject matter is too much for you, I understand and won't judge you for passing on this one. Again, thank you for watching and I hope that you have a good day.